The USGP started off strong, showing signs of promise towards the middle of the race, but ultimately ended up with the same result we've become accustomed to. Welcome back to the post-race show where I'm going to break down what happened throughout the race and just some of my thoughts on the race. If you do enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification button so that you stay up to date for when I do post videos such as this one. And with that, let's dive right in. Although he's had a couple very strong races, Piastri ended up going out right at the beginning of the race. Now, what we need to remember is that Piastri is still a rookie, and although he's been crushing it lately, he's bound to make some rookie mistakes. Throughout the entire weekend, he hadn't really been on par with his teammate Lando Norris, and the pace just wasn't there for him. But he ended up retiring very early in the race, and we didn't really get to see his pace throughout the race itself. However, I'm sure he'll come back strong next weekend in Mexico, because at this point, we're expecting him, and he's shown maturity that he can bounce back from a bad weekend and have a great result. The Ferraris always do something. After starting on pole position, Leclerc quickly found himself overtaken by Lando Norris going into turn 1. Besides that, Sainz found himself in P3 during the first lap. So what did the drivers decide to do? Well, they decide to fight each other. Sainz tries to overtake Leclerc, but it doesn't work. But all of this battling between them just gives Lando Norris a larger gap to Leclerc in second. And what's worse is that the tire wear on that Ferrari is so bad that they couldn't extract the full pace out of that car for many laps at the beginning, because they would simply overheat. Not to mention that Leclerc's Ferrari ended up getting disqualified, but I'll touch on that a bit later. Besides the Ferraris, we had Hamilton, who was pushing very hard at the beginning of the race. But as we know, he's an expert at managing tires, having repeatedly heard that his tires are gone and still pulling magic out of somewhere. Now, most cars have the strategy of a two-stop, and due to regulations that you have to use at least 2 different compounds, most cars started on medium tires and switched over to hard tires. Now, for the first half of the race, we actually believed that some cars would try to do a one-stop only. And this made it interesting because Norris, who was leading the race at this point, started the race on medium tires, having switched over to hard tires. But Max Verstappen, who started in P6 and was quickly catching up to Norris, had indeed stopped to change tires, but switched from a medium tire over to another medium tire. Now, this medium tire surely was quicker, and he was quickly gaining on Norris and did end up overtaking him, but he still had to do one more mandatory stop. So the idea is that many, myself included, believed that Norris would try to survive on those hard tires up until the end of the race. Now, at some point, Lando Norris decided to come into the pits and opt for another set of hard tires, which quickly opened up the door for Max to cover it, opting to pit as well and getting his hard tires on as well. At this point, there wasn't really much more that Norris could do, and all of our hopes of this being a great race due to different strategies basically went out the window. Hamilton was pushing very hard on his hard tires, having also went medium hard, but then what he did, he extended that second stint as well as his first stint and ended up ending the race on medium tires. Now, this gave him pace over Norris, who was ahead of him on hard tires, and he was very close to catching up to Max Verstappen as well, finishing the race just 2 seconds behind. This is where I have to add that both pit stops for Lewis Hamilton's car were quite poor, being around 3.5 seconds when everybody else was about 2.5 seconds. And if you calculate it, these 2 seconds are exactly what took the win away from him. So who knows what could have happened if they had managed to get a pit stop that was better. But ultimately, this didn't matter either because Lewis Hamilton was also disqualified from the race. But we'll get to that soon. Another interesting thing that happened throughout this race was that Verstappen wasn't quite as dominant as he has been throughout the season. I'm not going to touch on the qualifying lap where he went off track limits, ended up in him starting in P6. And of course, he quickly made his way up the field. But until about the last quarter of the race, we weren't so sure that Max was going to actually get this win. You could hear how agitated he was on his team radio, repeatedly screaming at his race engineer to not talk while he's under braking. Now, this could mean that due to the fact that he wasn't very confident under braking, the discrepancy between him and the rest of the field wasn't that large anymore. Or the regulations may finally be kicking in and the other cars are actually catching up. Towards the end of the race, we saw another disastrous Ferrari strategy. They opted to leave Charles Leclerc, who was starting on pole position, on a one-stop strategy. Towards the end of the race, when Charles clearly had no pace compared to the other cars around him, he he was ordered to let Sainz by, and he made it clear that he wasn't happy about this as he was starting on pole position and Carlos was further down the grid, so it made no sense how Carlos had caught up and had more pace. He said, "Let's talk after." And I would have loved to be in the room to hear that talk with those Ferrari strategists, because I don't understand what they're doing at this point. It's like they're trying to sabotage every race Charles Leclerc has with some strategy that's completely out there and completely crazy. And when they come up with things like they didn't have the right numbers, well, why didn't you have the right numbers? Don't you have all the data that other teams have? I mean, you're an F1 team. You're supposed to be able to know how the racing works, right? But anyways, Charles was unhappy and rightfully so. He was also fighting a tooth abscess, so he didn't have the best day from the get-go. And to make matters worse, as I mentioned, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton were both disqualified after the race. Now, this is tough for both drivers, and especially for Lewis Hamilton, who fought really hard to get onto the podium on P2. And as he's currently in a battle against Red Bull's other driver, Sergio Perez, for P2 and the driver championship, this would have been a huge amount of points that could maybe well decide the end result. 4 cars were checked to see if they were in violation, and out of those 4 cars, 2 of them were found to be cheating. Now, I personally believe that at this point you should check all the cars on the grid, or at least all the point scoring cars, because if 50% of the cars that you checked failed, then there's a very high probability that other cars also failed as well, or would fail if they had been checked. But it is what it is, the regulations are what they are, and this ended up disqualifying both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. And as a fun little fact, this also means that Charles Leclerc now has the perfect trifecta of a do not start, do not finish, and disqualification when starting from pole position. So good job, Ferrari. Another thing that I found quite uncalled for was that fans were booing Max Verstappen during the Dutch anthem. Now, I understand there's a lot of Mexicans that attend the US Grand Prix and a lot of Sergio Perez fans, but there's no need to boo a driver who's been absolutely dominant just because your driver isn't performing as well. I'm going to be curious to see what type of reception Max gets in Mexico, and I'm pretty sure it's not going to be a warm one, but it's going to be even more interesting to see how he responds. He doesn't seem like a person who cares too much about these things, but if anything, I think it'll light a fire in him and he'll try to absolutely dominate at the Mexican Grand Prix. That's next weekend, so I'm very curious to see what happens. Now, to finish off on a happier note, this was both Lando Norris's and George Russell's 100th career race. Lando Norris is visibly upset, or it's maybe getting to him that he hasn't been able to convert and win a race yet. You can see that his demeanor and attitude now are either a win or it's not good enough. And that's good in a sense because it might drive him and the team to keep pushing and keep pushing. He had a great race, finishing P3, which ultimately became P2 after Hamilton's disqualification. And it's only a matter of time until he wins a race because he has the pace, he has the talent, and as that car keeps improving the way McLaren has been doing this whole season, I'm sure it will come. So congratulations, Lando Norris, congratulations, George Russell, and I'm curious to see what they'll keep doing in the future. Overall, this wasn't the most interesting race, especially being a sprint weekend. We got to see the pace of the cars beforehand, so we kind of knew what to expect going into Sunday. There were a couple surprises, but this may just be due to some issues Max had with the car. I don't know. Either way, I'm hoping the Mexican Grand Prix, and especially the Brazilian Grand Prix, brings us more hype and more, maybe, diversification on strategy or on potential teams that can mix up the field. Thank you guys for watching this short breakdown of the Austin GP. If you did enjoy this video and want to see more videos like this in the future, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you're notified when another one does drop. Now, if you're curious in F1 related content throughout the week, make sure to subscribe to my X, formerly Twitter, which I'll link up on the screen here. On X, I tweet a lot about F1 and we can maybe have a conversation about your thoughts as well on certain topics or issues or anything you may like. Thank you guys for watching and see you next time. Bye.